In this video, the silent cure for depression. According to Nietzsche and Aristotle, we'll explore a deeper path to healing, one that doesn't come from medication or motivation, but from meaning. If you felt numb, disconnected, or like the weight you carry can't be put into words, this is for you. Because the cure may not be found in fixing yourself, but in finding yourself. You are not broken, you are being called to pause, to listen, to begin again, not louder, but truer. This isn't about escaping the darkness, it's about learning how to walk through it with your soul intact. When we hear the word depression today, we often reduce it to a clinical category. It's something to be treated with medication, managed with therapy, or labeled with diagnostic criteria. And while modern medicine has brought us important tools to understand the biological components of depression, Nietzsche and Aristotle viewed it through a far older and arguably deeper lens. They didn't see it simply as an illness of the mind, but as a collapse in the soul, not as a dysfunction, but as a cry from within, an existential alarm bell that something in the architecture of a person's life was no longer aligned with truth. To them, depression was not merely a state of sadness or chemical imbalance. It was a signal, a breakdown in purpose, a rupture in personal meaning. The individual who falls into depression is not just someone suffering from an emotional low, they are someone who has lost contact with the why behind their being. Nietzsche, in particular, had no illusions about the pain of life. He did not look away from suffering. In fact, he walked straight into it. But he believed that what made suffering unbearable was not the pain itself, it was the absence of meaning within that pain. He who has a why to live can bear almost any how, he wrote, echoing what would later be echoed by thinkers like Viktor Frankl. Depression, then, from Nietzsche's point of view, is not a result of suffering alone. It is suffering without a story. It is pain without a purpose. This is where Nietzsche's philosophy becomes more than academic. It becomes personal. He saw depression not as something to eliminate immediately, but as something to examine. He understood it as a signal that the individual had reached a breaking point, a psychological and spiritual threshold where the life they were living no longer held truth for them. The mask had become too heavy, the roles too empty, the distractions too thin. Depression then was a kind of death, but not an end. It was a necessary death, a symbolic death of the inauthentic self. This death, Nietzsche argued, was also the beginning of something sacred, self-overcoming. It is only when a person reaches the void, when they are emptied of all external motivations, performances, and borrowed beliefs, that they are finally free to ask, who am I really, and why am I here? The answers to those questions don't come quickly, they come in silence, in stillness, in the long dark nights where the ego dies and the soul awakens. Aristotle, on the other hand, approached this crisis from a different angle. He didn't use the word depression in the modern sense, but he spoke at length about what it means to live a fulfilled and purposeful life. He believed that every human being has a unique telos, a purpose, a final cause, a direction toward which their nature is meant to unfold. And when a person's life deviates from this inner purpose, suffering naturally arises, not because they are weak, but because they are misaligned. In Aristotle's terms, a life lived out of alignment with one's telos results in the absence of eudaimonia, a word often translated as happiness, but which more accurately means human flourishing. This flourishing is not based on temporary pleasure or surface-level success. It is the deep and sustainable well-being that emerges when a person lives in harmony with their highest values and virtues. So when a woman, for example, experiences depression in a life that looks perfect on the outside, a stable job, a relationship, social approval, Aristotle would not be surprised. He would ask, is this life aligned with her telos? Is she living her truth, or someone else's expectations? Is she practicing virtues that bring her into balance, or is she performing a role that disconnects her from herself? Both philosophers converge on one powerful idea, that depression is not just something that happens to us, it is something that happens within us, often when we have lost contact with the deeper structure of our being. Depression is the collapse of a story we've outgrown, and it leaves us with a terrifying but necessary question: now what? The modern world often treats depression as a problem to be solved as quickly as possible, and in some cases, especially with severe clinical depression, immediate treatment is essential. But Nietzsche and Aristotle offer a parallel truth, that not all depression is pathological. Some of it is philosophical. Some of it is the soul's rebellion against a life that no longer feels real. And for that kind of depression, the cure is not distraction, it is reconstruction. It is in the silence, in the stillness, in the absence of outer noise that this reconstruction can begin. When the ego crumbles and the persona dissolves, the person is left with themselves. This is not comfortable, it is disorienting, but it is also where the seed of transformation is planted. This is the space where a new story can begin, not the old story of fitting in, but the true story of becoming. Nietzsche called this moment a revaluation of all values. Aristotle called it the cultivation of virtue. Both knew that it required courage, not the courage to fake it, but the courage to feel, the courage to be broken, the courage to ask questions with no immediate answers, and most of all, the courage to begin again. Because in that silent space where depression speaks, you may find not your end but your beginning, and that is where meaning returns. When most people think about happiness, they imagine something that happens to them. A good day, a moment of success, a warm connection. Happiness to many feels like a fleeting state, a high to chase, or a mood to maintain. But Aristotle's view was entirely different. He didn't believe happiness was something you stumbled into. He believed it was something you became, slowly, consciously, through the way you live, not just what you feel. His word for this kind of happiness was eudaimonia, which loosely translates to human flourishing. But eudaimonia is not pleasure, it is not comfort, and it is definitely not the temporary relief we often associate with escaping depression. Eudaimonia is deeper. It is the state of being fully in tune with your purpose, your nature, and your values. It is not a reward at the end of a journey. It is the journey itself, when lived in the right way. For Aristotle, the root of all true well-being was virtue, not moral perfection, but the daily practice of living in balance with your true self. This means courage when you feel afraid, honesty when it's easier to pretend, moderation when you crave excess, and kindness not only to others but to yourself. He believed that a good life wasn't built by chasing good feelings, it was built by cultivating good habits. This is where Aristotle's thought becomes quietly revolutionary in how we think about depression. Depression often makes people feel out of control, out of reach. It creates fog, detachment, and the belief that nothing matters. And in that state, motivation can vanish. The world can feel flat. Even the smallest tasks, getting out of bed, preparing a meal, making a phone call, can feel insurmountable. In those moments, the idea of pursuing happiness feels laughable. But Aristotle never said to pursue happiness. He said to pursue virtue, and happiness would follow. That distinction is everything. Rather than asking yourself, what will make me feel better right now? Aristotle invites a different question. What action reflects the person I want to become? It may not feel good in the moment, but over time, repeated action aligned with your values begins to reshape your inner world. This is what Aristotle meant by habit, that who you become is shaped not by what you feel occasionally, but by what you practice consistently. You may not feel brave, but when you act with courage anyway, you plant the seeds of resilience. You may not feel kind, but when you extend compassion anyway, you begin to soften. You may not feel worthy, but when you honor your responsibilities despite your despair, you quietly build dignity. This approach to healing isn't flashy, it's not fast, it doesn't give you instant relief, but it's steady, it's rooted, and that's why it works. Because depression at its core often robs people of rhythm. It creates stagnation, it breaks momentum, it disrupts the natural movement of energy and purpose. But virtue-based living, according to Aristotle, reintroduces rhythm. It reconnects you to cause and effect, to the power of choice, to the structure of becoming. It's important to recognize that Aristotle didn't believe virtue meant never struggling. He knew humans were flawed, emotional, and inconsistent. That's why he emphasized the golden mean, the middle path between excess and deficiency. For example, courage isn't fearlessness, it's the balanced state between cowardice and recklessness. Generosity isn't self-sacrifice, it's the balance between greed and neglect. Healing through eudaimonia doesn't require perfection, it requires presence, attention, a willingness to meet yourself in the middle, every day. There's something powerful about this kind of inner path to healing, especially in a world that tells us to constantly look outward. We're told to fix ourselves with products, goals, praise, and distractions. But Aristotle offers a different model, one that says the solution is not in adding more, but in returning to what is essential. Your habits, your values, your intentions, and most importantly, your character. Because in his view, character is not a label. It's a practice. It's what you do when no one is watching. It's how you respond when things fall apart. It's the quiet force that holds you upright when everything else tells you to collapse. And when depression leaves you feeling like you've lost yourself, character is the compass that brings you home. There is healing in that idea. Not because it's easy, but because it's true. You do not have to wait to feel good before you start living well. You do not have to escape your pain to return to your purpose. You can begin exactly where you are, with exactly what you have, and when you do, you may find something surprising. Not a sudden rush of joy, not a dramatic recovery, but a quiet shift, a softening of despair, a flicker of self-respect, a moment of stillness that doesn't feel empty but full. That is eudaimonia in its earliest form, the return of your soul to your body, the reunion of your choices with your nature, the moment when healing stops being something you chase and starts being something you become. Friedrich Nietzsche never shied away from pain. In fact, he stared directly into it. While others tried to anesthetize suffering or explain it away, Nietzsche leaned into its fire. He believed that suffering wasn't merely something to endure. It was a crucible, a sacred space where transformation becomes possible, and at the heart of that transformation was what he called self-overcoming. To understand this concept, you must first understand how Nietzsche saw the self, not as a fixed identity, but as a process, a becoming. He didn't view people as static beings with a single truth to discover. Instead, he believed the self was something to be shaped, challenged, burned, and reassembled. And depression in Nietzsche's world wasn't simply an affliction. It was a sign that the self had reached a dead end, that the current form of your identity was no longer sustainable. Something old needed to die for something new to be born. Nietzsche wrote during a time when the world was losing its inherited structures, religion, tradition, certainty. He saw that people were falling into despair, not because life had become harder, but because it had become meaningless. The systems that once told them who they were and why they existed were dissolving. And in their place, a terrible freedom emerged, the freedom to define your own life, your own values, your own path. But with that freedom came a heavy burden, responsibility. To Nietzsche, depression often signaled the moment a person could no longer live under borrowed values. The mask they had worn for years, perhaps a mask of being agreeable, successful, obedient, or good, had begun to crack. And beneath that mask, they found not a clear self, but chaos, a void, an uncomfortable question. If I'm not who I was pretending to be, then who am I really? This is where the process of self-overcoming begins. Self-overcoming is not about fixing yourself. It's not about becoming better in the eyes of others or returning to some former version of who you were. It is the active, intentional destruction of the parts of you that were built from fear, conformity, or survival, and the conscious reconstruction of a self rooted in truth. It's not healing for the sake of normalcy, it's transformation for the sake of freedom. Depression then becomes a threshold, a moment in the dark where you stop running, stop performing, and finally sit with the pain, not to wallow in it, but to mine it, to ask, what is this pain trying to show me? What part of me is asking to be born? These are not comfortable questions, but they are essential, because without them you remain in exile from yourself, alive, but not fully living. Nietzsche believed that to overcome suffering, you must not avoid it, you must transmute it. Like an alchemist, you turn pain into power, confusion into clarity, despair into direction, not because it's romantic, but because it's necessary. The rawness of depression is not a flaw, it is the invitation. It strips away illusion, it silences noise, it leaves you with the uncomfortable gift of truth. And what does self-overcoming actually look like in daily life? It begins with honesty, radical, uncomfortable honesty, admitting that the life you've been living no longer fits, that the job, the relationship, the mask you wear in public, they don't reflect who you are becoming. It's the courage to grieve a version of yourself that no longer serves you. And then slowly, with discipline and vision, you begin the work of building a new self. Not for applause, not for perfection, but for alignment. Nietzsche didn't believe in instant enlightenment. He believed in struggle, in resistance, in becoming strong not in spite of your pain, but through it. "What does not kill me makes me stronger," he famously wrote. But that's often misunderstood. He wasn't glorifying pain. He was reminding us that growth requires friction, that without tension, muscles don't form. Without resistance, wisdom doesn't deepen. Self-overcoming is that quiet decision you make each morning to show up, even when everything in you wants to disappear. It's the choice to speak the truth when lying would be easier, to break a pattern, even when it feels like home, to say no when the world expects yes. These are small acts, but over time they form a self that is real, a self that can weather storms not because it's invincible, but because it's true. This path is lonely at times, because to become yourself, you must often walk away from who others need you to be. Friends may not understand, family may resist, society will almost certainly disapprove. But Nietzsche believed that only by stepping into that discomfort could you claim your life as your own. You are not here to be a copy. You are here to be a creation, and that creation doesn't happen through comfort. It happens through the fire of becoming. So if you are in the grip of depression, ask yourself not just, how do I escape this, but what in me is trying to emerge? What have I outgrown? What lie am I still living? What truth am I ready to embody? You may not have all the answers, but in the asking, in the willingness to face the pain, you begin the slow, sacred work of self-overcoming. Because your suffering is not pointless, it is a passage, and what waits on the other side is not just healing, it's a self you've never met, but have always been destined to become. In the modern world, silence is often mistaken for weakness, stillness is confused with passivity, and doing nothing is labeled as laziness. But to Nietzsche and Aristotle, the silent spaces between doing and being were not empty, they were sacred. Both philosophers, in very different ways, understood something that the noise of our age tends to drown out, that real transformation doesn't come through constant stimulation or external validation. It comes through deep, inward attention. To reclaim your life in the midst of depression, they would not advise you to run faster, work harder, or numb yourself with distractions. Instead, they would ask you to slow down, to sit still, to listen, because it's in that silence, not in the performance, that the truth begins to stir. The silent cure isn't passive, it's just not loud. It is deliberate, reflective, and radically personal. Think of how we typically respond to emotional discomfort. When sadness arises, we scroll. When fear bubbles up, we overwork. When emptiness visits, we seek noise, music, screens, people, movement, anything to avoid the stillness. But Nietzsche and Aristotle invite a reversal. They suggest that in that stillness is precisely where the answers lie, because the pain you avoid contains the blueprint for your next evolution. It speaks, but it speaks quietly. If you're constantly escaping into noise, you'll never hear it. Nietzsche was painfully familiar with silence. Much of his life was spent in solitude, wrestling with inner demons, chronic illness, and the weight of existence. But in those silent years, he wrote some of the most transformative philosophical texts in history, not because he had escaped his suffering, but because he had learned how to meet it directly. For him, silence was not absence, it was confrontation, a space where the soul could finally speak without interruption. He didn't believe in filling that space with artificial optimism or shallow comforts. He believed in allowing the silence to show you what is real. That's where the work of becoming begins, not when you are told who you are, but when you begin to notice who you are not. The noisy world insists on identity, the silent world invites essence. Aristotle approached it differently, but his teachings lead to a similar place. His concept of contemplation, what he called thoria, was the highest form of human activity. It wasn't passive reflection, it was active engagement with truth. A deep inward gaze that aligned your mind, your habits, and your values. This was not something that could be achieved in chaos or crowd. It required inner quiet, a clearing in the self. He didn't mean isolation or withdrawal from life. Rather, he meant an inner posture, a way of paying attention, a willingness to sit with what is, without rushing to fix or change it. In this sense, Aristotle believed that silence was not emptiness, it was order, and depression, which often feels like inner chaos, could slowly be reordered by returning to stillness, contemplation, and the disciplined practice of living with intention. The modern self is constantly pulled outward. The average person checks their phone hundreds of times per day, lives by the metrics of likes and followers, and measures self-worth by productivity. In this climate, the idea of sitting silently with your thoughts seems almost threatening, but that's precisely the point. What you fear in silence is not the silence itself, it's what it might reveal. Nietzsche and Aristotle were not interested in distraction, they wanted depth. They wanted people to live lives that were honest, not just efficient, to wake up, not just get by. That awakening, they believed, happened through internal realignment, through rituals of attention, through the quiet rediscovery of meaning. This may look like solitude, walking alone without your phone, journaling when your thoughts feel tangled, reading texts that challenge you, sitting in meditation, not to escape, but to face. It could be in small decisions, slowing your breath instead of numbing your feelings, choosing depth over speed, choosing reflection over reaction. These moments are not dramatic, they won't impress anyone, but they are the foundation of a different kind of life, a real one, because at the heart of depression is not just sadness, it's disconnection, from purpose, from self, from soul, and that disconnection cannot be fixed by piling on more noise. It requires stillness. It requires asking deeper questions. It requires the courage to be with yourself without distraction. Silence is not nothingness. Silence is space. Space to feel, space to listen, space to become. Nietzsche called this the space of becoming who you are. Aristotle called it living in accordance with virtue and reason, but both pointed to the same silent truth. You don't heal by escaping yourself. You heal by returning to yourself, fully, honestly, quietly, and that return always begins in silence. There is a kind of healing the world doesn't teach. It doesn't come in the form of a quick solution or an inspirational quote. It comes in the slow, patient work of returning to yourself, not the version the world applauds, but the one that sits quietly behind your eyes when no one is watching. Depression is not just sadness. It's the soul's quiet protest, a refusal to keep living in ways that betray your nature, and both Nietzsche and Aristotle knew this. They saw suffering not as a mistake to erase, but as a message to translate. They didn't speak in clinical language. They spoke in the language of becoming, of virtue, of transformation. Nietzsche showed us that pain, when faced with courage, can become a doorway, that the darkness is not your enemy, it's your initiation. Through self-overcoming, the parts of you that once felt broken become the blueprint for something truer, more resilient, more whole. Aristotle showed us that healing is not a destination, but a direction. That eudaimonia, a deep, stable flourishing, comes not from chasing happiness, but from choosing virtue, from choosing to show up with integrity when it would be easier to disappear, from building habits that restore dignity and inner rhythm to a life that has lost its shape. And both, in different voices, taught this truth. You will not find yourself in the noise. You will not heal by rushing. You will not come home to your life by escaping it. You heal in silence. You transform in stillness. You become in the quiet space where you no longer pretend. So if you are in the dark right now, don't panic, don't perform, and most of all, don't run. Sit with it. Let it speak. Let it show you what can no longer continue. Let it strip away the lies. And when you are ready, begin again, not with noise, but with intention, not with a mask, but with your truth, because you were not meant to survive your life, you were meant to shape it. And in the end, the silent cure is not about eliminating pain, it's about discovering the strength to grow from it. That's where your story begins again, and this time, it's finally yours.